Welcome back, everyone, to Echoes of Ihsan. And today we are doing another deep dive, you guessed it, into the Sahih Muslim. This time we're looking at Hadith, Book 24, Clothes and Decoration.
I love this one. I'm excited to jump into this.
This is going to be a really fascinating one, I
Yeah.
think, because, it's something that everyone kind of thinks about and has a relationship with. You get up every day and you put clothes on and you decorate your house.
Yeah.
So let's jump in. I think one of the first things that caught my attention was the really strong prohibition against using gold and silver vessels for eating and drinking.
Yeah.
It's not just like, hey, this is not a good idea or this is frowned upon.
Yeah.
It's like you're drinking fire from hell.
Yeah, and it's multiple hadiths. It's not just one. So, multiple people narrating from the Prophet. And, just to add to that, some of the companions of the Prophet, Salama and Abdul they're narrating some of these.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So this is like a pretty serious thing. This isn't just like a fringe idea. So why is it like that? What's going on?
I think one of the things that we can say is that, gold and silver are inherently extravagant. And, especially going back to, the time of Revelation, these were symbols of wealth and status.
So it's not just about the material itself, but what it represents.
Yeah, exactly. And like if you think about it, right now we have luxury brands,
Yeah.
right? And luxury items that are symbols of status.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. So using those for mundane things like eating and drinking is sending a particular message.
It's interesting because it's like, in Islam, we're told that, humility is important and simplicity is important and detachment from worldly things is important.
Right.
And then using these like lavish, vessels kind of seems to contradict that.
Right. And even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about extravagance.
Yeah.
And spending, your wealth in the wrong ways. There's a lot of verses in the Quran about that we should be, giving zakat.
Doing in charity, yeah.
Spending our money in the right way. So
Right.
this is kind of an extension of that.
And, it's not to say that you can't have nice things, but it's just like making sure that your choices are aligning with
Right, with your values.
with your values. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. It makes you think about intentionality. So, that's kind of an interesting theme. We see this with the silk and the brocade clothing for men.
Right.
Again, we're not talking about like this is discouraged. It's like you're not going to have a share in the hereafter if you're wearing this.
All right.
It's pretty extreme.
Yeah, the consequences are laid out there. And it's mentioned in multiple hadiths again. And it's
Yeah.
coming from, Muawiyah and Hudhaifa and Ibn Umar.
Okay, so this is pretty serious.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to point out there are exceptions to this rule, right? Because if someone is sick, they can wear silk.
Mm-hmm.
We see this in Hadith 5168.
Right. And that kind of makes you think about the reasoning behind it, right? Because if it was the silk itself that was the problem, then it would be the problem in all situations.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's something deeper going on.
So what do you think that is? What's the deeper reason?
I think it's about extravagance and pride.
Okay.
And it's interesting because the Prophet ﷺ, he actually, he's mentioned wearing silk in some situations.
Really?
Yeah, like when he was gifted a silk garment.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
He wore it, for a short time and he gave it away.
To avoid that sense of like...
Of attachment to it.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And I'm curious about this too because we see that silk is okay for women to wear, in a headscarf.
Yeah, there are hadiths about that.
Yeah, like Asma, the daughter of Abu Bakr.
Right.
She kept, the prophet's cloak that was trimmed with silk,
Yeah.
and they used it for healing.
And that's really interesting because it shows you that, it's not just like a simple rule. There are these different, applications.
Yeah, there's different layers that you have to look at.
Right. And there are different schools of thought about these things that we have to keep in mind, too.
Okay, so we've got to be careful not to make like really simple conclusions.
Without looking at all the different
All the nuances, yeah.
nuances. Yeah. Okay. So before we move on to the next section, I do want to touch on, the Prophet's own choices in clothing.
Yes.
Because this is something that's really fascinating to me. Because, in the hadiths, we see him described as wearing these very simple garments.
Right, like the Yemeni mantle.
Yeah, and even clothes made of wool and...
Camel hair.
Yeah, camel hair.
Very coarse materials.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, in some cultures, religious leaders are expected to dress very...
Ornately,
yeah. And this is like the complete opposite.
Right, and it shows you that, true leadership isn't about outward appearances.
Yeah.
It's about You know, the qualities of humility,
Yeah.
generosity.
So it's really about who you are on the inside.
Exactly.
Not what you're
projecting on the inside.
projecting,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And it's interesting because it wasn't just his clothing. There's that hadith about, his pillow and his bedding.
Right, made of leather stuffed with palm fiber.
Yeah, it's like, wow, this is as simple as you can get.
This is a very simple life.
Right.
Even though, he was the leader of a growing community.
Yeah.
So what do you think that tells us about what he valued?
I think it shows that, he valued, contentment and moderation.
Okay.
And, it's interesting how all of these things tie together, right? We talked about the vessels, we talked about the clothing, now we're talking about the bedding. It all points to this idea of not being attached to material things.
Yeah, it's about simplicity.
Right. And it's like if he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who reached the highest level of, spiritual, like achievement,
Yeah.
lived such a simple life, then what does that say about us?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it really makes you think about your own life and your own priorities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to move on to another aspect of clothing that's addressed in the Hadiths. And that's the prohibition against trailing your garment out of pride.
Right.
This seems connected to, that theme of humility.
Yeah, there are multiple hadiths about this.
Mhm.
That, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't look at the person who does this out of arrogance.
Right, and there's even that story about the man who was punished for walking with pride because of his fine clothing.
Right. So it's a very serious matter.
Yeah, it's not just about, the clothing itself, but it's the intention behind it.
Right. And it's about Rhea, doing something to show off.
So it's a reminder that even something as simple as like how we wear our clothes can have spiritual implications.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, before we move on, there's this one thing that kind of seems like a contradiction,
Right.
and that's the Prophet forbidding gold rings.
Right.
But he wore a silver ring himself.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of discussion about that.
So what do you think is going on there?
Well, some scholars say that it was about the cultural significance of gold at the time.
Mhm.
Gold was associated with royalty and power.
So maybe it was about distancing himself from those worldly associations.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And others have said that, the silver ring was actually used as a seal.
Right, because he used to seal documents with it.
Exactly. So it had a practical purpose.
So even when it comes to like adornment, intention and purpose matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one more thing before we move on. The hadith that disapproves of like excessive bedding and carpets.
Right.
It says, there should be a bedding for the man, a bedding for his wife, and a third one for a guest.
And anything beyond that is from Shaitan.
So why is that? Why is it so specific?
I think it goes back to that same idea of, moderation, contentment, not being attached to material things.
So our homes should be, spaces of peace.
Right. Tranquility, not cluttered with stuff.
Yeah, it's like that mental and emotional clutter that can come from
having too much.
Yeah, from having too much and always wanting more.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on now to a topic that's really interesting and a little bit complex, and that's the prohibition of pictures and portraits.
Yes.
This is a big one when it comes to, Islamic art and...
It's something that a lot of people have questions about.
Yeah, and it's easy to misunderstand if you don't look at the historical context and the nuances.
And then the nuances, right? Because,
Yeah.
This emerged in a time and place where idolatry and image worship were very common. And so the prohibition against images was a way of safeguarding the belief in the oneness of God.
So it's about avoiding anything that could potentially lead to
Shirk.
shirk, right?
What was it?
Associating partners with God.
Right. And that's like the biggest sin in Islam.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate no-no.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about this hadith that really kind of confused me a little bit at first glance.
Yeah.
The one about angels not entering a house with pictures or dogs.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
It's like, what's the connection?
Yeah, I mean, at first glance, it seems kind of strange.
Yeah.
But if you look into, the interpretations offered by scholars, it starts to make a little bit more sense.
So what are they saying about this?
Well, some scholars say that it's about creating a sacred space in the home where you can, connect with God, free from distractions.
So both pictures and dogs are seen as distractions in this context.
Right, in different ways.
Yeah.
Pictures could become objects of fascination
Yeah.
or even veneration. And dogs, while they're beloved companions in many cultures,
Yeah.
they were sometimes associated with impurity.
Yeah, in some societies.
Wow.
So it's like, okay, if you want to create this space where you can really connect with the divine, you need to be mindful of what you bring into that space.
Exactly. And that's something that we see in other spiritual traditions as well.
Yeah, like the idea of creating a sacred space. It's
Mhm.
not unique to Islam.
Right.
Okay, so to complicate matters a bit, we have the story of Aisha
Mm-hmm.
and the curtain with pictures.
Right.
So she had this curtain, and the Prophet ﷺ was not happy about it. But then, they repurposed the fabric and made cushions, and that was okay.
Right. And that's an interesting story because it shows you that, it's not just about the images themselves, but the potential for those images to become objects of veneration.
Right, so it's back to that idea of, like, what are you focusing on?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by making them into cushions, they're no longer the focal point.
They're just part of a functional object.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. It also highlights the importance of asking for clarification when you're not sure.
Right.
Aisha radiyallahu anha, she didn't just assume.
Yeah, she went straight to the source.
She went straight to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asked.
Yeah.
And that's something that we should all do,
Mm-hmm.
when we're not sure about something.
Seek knowledge.
Seek knowledge, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay, so we've talked about the potential dangers of images, but there's also this really strong condemnation of those who create images,
Right.
like in the first place.
Yeah.
And the Hadiths use some pretty intense language.
Yeah. They talk about, those who create images being among those who are punished the most severely on the day of judgment.
Yeah.
And they're commanded to breathe life into what they've created.
Which is impossible.
Which is impossible, right?
Right, yeah.
So it's very strong imagery.
But even within this strong prohibition, there are glimpses of exceptions.
Right. Right.
Like the Hadith that mentions it's okay to have images of trees and lifeless things.
Right.
So it's not a blanket ban on all art.
Exactly. And it seems like the primary concern is with the depiction of living beings.
Especially humans and animals.
Right, because that gets into that area of, are you trying to imitate the creator?
So it's about recognizing that only God can create life.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
But there are still different interpretations of this.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. Different schools of thought have different opinions on, what types of images are permissible.
Okay, so once again, we have to be careful about making black and white conclusions.
Right.
It's a lot more nuanced than that.
It's an ongoing discussion.
Yeah. And I'm sure our listeners are already thinking about, like, how do these hadiths shape our understanding of art in Islam and the boundaries between human creation and divine creation?
And those are important questions to think about.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we get too deep into that, we do have some other interesting practices to cover.
Yes.
So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about this hadith that forbids men from dyeing their clothes with saffron.
Okay.
Now, saffron was a pretty valuable spice back then.
Very valuable.
So this seems like it might be about avoiding extravagance again.
Right. I mean, saffron was associated with luxury,
Yeah.
ostentation. So, yeah, it goes back to that theme.
But then we have this other hadith that allows the dyeing of white hair.
As long as it's not black.
As long as it's not black. Yeah. So what's the distinction there?
Right. That's an interesting question. It seems like with the saffron, it's about avoiding that showiness,
Okay.
that outward display of wealth. Whereas with dyeing white hair, it's more about, maintaining a neat and presentable appearance.
So it's about respect.
Right. Respect for oneself, respect for others.
It's like, don't be overly showy, but don't be neglectful of your appearance either.
Right. Find that middle ground.
Find that balance.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. And speaking of avoiding extremes, we have that hadith that forbids shaving part of the head and leaving part unshaven.
Right. The qaza hairstyle.
Yeah. What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, it seems like it was a fashion statement back then.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And Islam discouraged it,
Good.
perhaps because it was a way of, standing out from the community.
Yeah, it's like, we're all in this together.
Right.
We're one ummah.
Yeah,
Let's not try to, draw attention to ourselves or set ourselves apart.
exactly.
Okay, so once again,
Mm.
we see this emphasis on simplicity, moderation, unity.
Yeah.
And it's about finding that balance between expressing your individuality
Mm-hmm.
and honoring the values of the group.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's fascinating how all these little details about personal grooming
Mm-hmm.
and appearance all tie back to these larger themes
They do.
in Islam.
They do.
Yeah, it's amazing how these hadiths collected centuries ago
Yeah,
are still relevant today.
absolutely.
It's really a testament to their wisdom.
Yeah.
Okay, well, before we get too carried away, we do have a few more fascinating practices to discuss.
We do.
So let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, and then we'll dive back into Sahih Muslim and its insights into Islamic guidelines on clothing and adornment.
Sounds good. So we're back and ready to wrap up our exploration of Hadith Book 24, Clothes and Decoration.
This section of Sahih Muslim has really opened up some fascinating insights, hasn't it?
It really has. We've gone deep into how Islamic teachings address clothing and adornment, from those specific guidelines to the broader spiritual principles at play.
And I think what's really struck me is that it's not just about the outward appearance, but the inner intentions that really matter.
Right. Intention is everything in Islam. It's the foundation of our actions, and that's reflected in how we approach even seemingly mundane things like what we wear.
It's about aligning our outer choices with those inner values.
Absolutely. And this idea resonates in various aspects of the Hadith collection.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of resonance, one hadith that left a strong impression on me was the one forbidding the beating of animals on their faces or cauterizing them.
That one's powerful, isn't it? It speaks volumes about the Islamic emphasis on compassion, extending it even to animals.
Yeah, it really highlights that respect and kindness aren't just meant for humans, but for all of creation.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that inherent value and dignity in every living being.
Now let's circle back to personal practices. I'm still pondering that hadith about men dyeing their clothes with saffron. We've connected it to extravagance, but I feel like there might be more to unpack there.
Well, you're spot on about the extravagance part. Saffron was a luxury back then, associated with showing off wealth.
So it's about shifting the focus from external displays to what truly matters internally.
Exactly. And it's interesting how that contrasts with the hadith allowing the dyeing of white hair as long as it isn't dyed black.
Right. That distinction always makes me pause. Why is one type of dyeing permitted while the other is prohibited?
It all comes down to intention again. Dyeing clothes with saffron could be seen as seeking attention or trying to impress others.
While dyeing white hair with a color other than black is more about maintaining a presentable look with age.
Right. It becomes about respect for oneself and for others.
So it's not necessarily about rejecting the act of altering one's appearance altogether.
It's about aligning those choices with the right intentions and values.
Exactly. And that focus on intention seems to be a consistent thread running through these teachings.
Oh, absolutely. It applies not just to clothing and adornment, but to our entire lives.
Okay, one last practice that caught my eye was the hadith prohibiting that hairstyle where part of the head is shaved and part is left unshaven, the qazaz.
Ah, yes. That one was likely discouraged because it was a trendy hairstyle back then, and it could be seen as a way of trying to stand out or seeking attention.
So Islam was encouraging unity within the community by discouraging such practices.
Exactly. And this is especially crucial considering that during the Prophet's time, the Muslim community was still establishing its identity.
Makes sense. It's about prioritizing the well-being and unity of the community over individual desires.
Precisely. And it also ties back to that emphasis on simplicity, focusing on what truly matters rather than getting caught up in fleeting trends.
As we conclude our deep dive into Sahih Muslim and its insights on clothing and adornment, that theme of intentionality and mindfulness really stands out.
I agree. It's not about blind adherence to rules. It's about understanding the wisdom behind them and making choices that reflect our values.
Choices that align our outward actions with our inner state.
Beautifully put. And that's a message that resonates far beyond clothing and adornment. It's a universal principle for a meaningful life.
It is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to emphasize that the learning doesn't end here. There's always more to explore, more to learn.
Keep seeking knowledge, keep reflecting, and keep striving to live a life of purpose and meaning.
Thank you all for joining us on this journey through Sahih Muslim. Until next time.